recording now. And hopefully the recording has started and you also have seen it. Okay, Pavel, so very warm welcome once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Anya. I'm very thankful that I'm able to present my work here. It's, as you know, very special to me. And I think it's my first presentation ever at the Institute of European Ethnology, of Anthropology and Ethnology at the University of Warsaw. So the more I'm thankful to you for this. I prepared my introducing text in Polish, so I have to translate it back into English. So what I'm going to present here is a part of, or mostly I presented it already at the Viadrina Center Borders in Motion at my university, but it's a paper that will be published, I hope soon, in European Urban and Regional Studies Journal in a special issue titled A Union in Distress: Contested Specialities of European Disintegration. And today I will talk about necronormativity and resilience, two, or, concepts that I think that mirror or show the reality that I experienced in Berlin, a reality of HIV positive marginalized migrants who are often also affected by substance abuse. And who are also not depicted as enemy or the significant other, but as excluded and vulnerable in a state of precarity that are threats to healthy part of the population. So these analytical tools come from resilience research. This is research coming mostly from human geography and urban governance. And I think they enable to show the logic of bureaucratic everyday life exclusions and hierarchies in ways of functioning and forms of post-liberal nation state, particularly in context of migration. These logics and mechanisms produce something that in literature is called death worlds. And as I will try to show, these death worlds emerged in interstices between national and European regimes and state regimes or systems such as healthcare system, welfare system, social welfare system, migration control system, and police system. So I think my message today is, with this perspective on resilience policies, enables to push the discussion on control of migration and access to healthcare in other direction than everyday bordering, which is quite significant literature already, also on the intersection of migration control and healthcare, and on deservingness, practices of deservingness of migrants to access healthcare. So there I start. And if I speak to you quickly, just interrupt me, because I won't be able to follow the chat. So just say, Pavel, you're speaking too quickly, or we don't understand you. So I want to move the emphasis from bordering mechanisms to resilience policy. There has been already a lot written on bordering, on everyday bordering, on dispersed political borders. Okay, it works. Also in context of healthcare system, although mostly focusing on asylum seekers. Little research has been done in this context on inner EU migration. Some research focus on access to social welfare and on production on unwanted migrants within inner EU migration. And there's some research on use of health care system of migrants from Central and Eastern Europe in old Europe. And this research shows that these people rather go back to the country of origin to use healthcare system. Research on borders and bordering mechanisms focus mostly on irregular migrants and asylum seekers, those affected mostly by racism, but whose legal situation is different than that of EU migrants. This research is often framed by critical perspectives on humanitarianism. A more recent research on borders in healthcare focuses on deservingness. Do migrants deserve, how they can deserve, what practices makes them deserving, and on moral economies. On moral economies, particularly Sharoui, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this name properly, notices the tension between biopolitical rationale of healthcare and growing repression systems put on migrants and migration control, leading to ambivalent practices. This research points also to gender aspect of deservingness in accessing healthcare, as well as growing tendency to question implementation of health rights in favor of accessing healthcare provisions through personal relationships framed by moral discourses in a given community. So the research notices a shift from legal entitlements and struggle over health rights into relational access to healthcare and relational dimension of rights to health. Research also shows that UK and Germany are persistent in barring migrants from health rights as opposed to Southern European states. What is also important to mention is research on inner EU migration in Germany that show complex bureaucratic processes installed to keep EU migrants on low-paid job market. These perspectives, however, do not focus on healthcare issues and accompanying biopolitics, as they assume dichotomic structure between repressive state barring EU migrants from social welfare system and victimized migrants. Scarce research on access to healthcare of migrants in Berlin, most of all asylum seekers, is again stressing deservingness and racism. It does not consider EU migration, although there are big numbers of EU migrants in Berlin, not least living on the streets. Plus, there's very little research in anthropology in Germany on HIV in general, so in medical anthropology. Social research on HIV is predominantly done in public health and focusing on migrants from Africa. There is no research that frames the EU as bio and necropolitical actor, focusing on consequences of European policies on life-sustaining or life-ending consequences within the EU. There is research on Frontex and its action on European borders, and there is research on bio and necropolitics of European states in context of so-called illegal migrants and the migration crisis, or on bio and necropolitical interventions intersecting with racism that should regulate migration. For example, one of my colleagues at the Viadrina University, Estela Schindel, shows how EU border enforcement pushes unwanted migrants into zones of exposure to environmental risk. Border struggle, as she writes, is displaced into seemingly natural terrain. EU border is a border of biopolitics, beyond which life is detached from life-sustaining infrastructures. I want to set out from this point and contribute to the consideration of EU migration politics in which the EU sets out biopolitical and necropolitical frames in a complex field of migration control within the EU. My ethnography shows how EU policies, by setting out freedom of movement, Schengen regime, and EU citizenship on one hand, and leaving healthcare policies to national level on the other, how these policies have biopolitical meaning and consequence, and how divisions are drawn in face of liberal discourse on EU integration. I want to show how the EU fosters liberal values, most of all through notion of EU citizenship, but in more concealed way leaves the implementation of this concept to the nationally framed solutions that have necropolitical consequences and lead to the emergence of death worlds, a racist and original politics guided by the principle of capital exploitation of those traditionally not seen as worth of taking part in life-sustaining policies. And that's something that contradicts the principle of an ever closer union written down in the treaties. Based on this overview, I want to contribute further to the research on dispersed borders with more nuanced perspective on bio and necropolitics, and to understand the ways decisions are made, who deserves life and who doesn't, how these death worlds emerged. As for the research on access of migrants to healthcare, I want to take a closer look at this relational and more individualized access to healthcare, but away from the frames of humanitarianism and deservingness. Although healthcare seems to be a natural field to develop new conceptualizations of resilience, it is the research on urban governance and security that developed conceptual tools to grasp new dynamics in racist urban governance in post-liberal Western state. Necropolitics was developed by Achille Mbembe as a flip side of biopolitics in context of settler colonialism or colonial occupation and exploitation. It is a politics that subjugates life to the power of death, as opposed to biopolitics that fosters life. It refers to exceptional power that sentences people to death in order to sustain life, something that happens in state of emergency when in which regular law is suspended and martial law enforced. However, discussion on necropolitics within security politics have led researchers to the conclusion that necropolitical action are present without state of emergency. This body of research shows how emergency politics displaces exceptionality altogether and introduces death politics inscribed in regular operations of security politics and politics of urban resilience governance. In resilience policy, vulnerable populations are a potential threat, and vulnerability is described as a susceptibility to becoming antisocial or exposed to threat of becoming terrorist or criminal. This threat can be prevented if vulnerable populations experience support and care. So what we have here, as opposed to necropolitics, is a shift from liberal understanding of evil as the other to the socialization of evil as an emergent product of unintended outcome of complex social interconnections, from being considered as other to the norm to being entirely imbricated within it. On that account, there can be no necropolitics, no abandonment of others who fall outside of the normativity, no social death, no specifying and controlling of target groups, no displacement or containment of unwanted or dangerous elements through preemptive action or spatial enclosure, and no sentencing to death in the sight of law in order to protect life. Grescott calls this kind of situation necronormativity. Resilience governance involves necronormativity as unexceptional form of death politics. In necronormativity, there is no differentiation and seclusion of dangerous population or subjects as in necropolitics. Protection of subjects or populations from crime and security threats or from evil or the other is being done through preparedness and overcoming of vulnerabilities, through support and empowerment of those deemed as vulnerable in order to bridge the gap and preparedness. Grescott shows, however, how reinterpretation of evil or enemy into vulnerable is no less racist, and differentiations and hierarchizations of racist necropolitics are still in place, but in different form. While studies on urban governance show how racialized minorities in cities are deemed vulnerable, there is much longer history of such policies in public health that deem vulnerable those suffering from health issues, from health disparities, those experiencing discrimination and unequal access to healthcare. Resilience policies in healthcare are based also on the assumption that the state of emergency is constant. I have not encountered considerations on necropolitics in context of public health policies, but in context of what is said about urban governance politics, it seems to be legitimate to point out similar resilience policies in healthcare that are focused on preparedness for a constant threat and outbreak of the pandemics, which might be quite questionable if we think of some state systems in some states. If the threat is dispersed and resilience policy is focused on vulnerable populations, those affected by the virus or those threatening to contract the virus, it is legitimate to claim that there will also be necronormativity in such resilience policies. My claim, based on my example of HIV-positive EU migrants, is that there is no naming of unwanted others as carriers of threat, and such actions has been abandoned already a long time ago in a context of HIV care, as an emanation of rational liberal politics of non-discrimination. And Berlin is very keen on sustaining an image of tolerant and liberal city that is free from discrimination. And this picture shows you a post of city of Berlin and the mayor of one of districts of Berlin, Tempelhof-Schöneberg, that signs a document about, positive life, how the city is supporting a life of HIV positive people. The liberal discourse on EU integration only reinforced the tendency to not name the threatening European other, but necropolitics nevertheless exist, or rather I should say necronormativity. It is more dispersed and normativized. Now let's focus more on this normativity. Resilience policies blur not only friend-enemy dichotomy, but also legal and operational separation between policing, military, and intelligence. When lines are blurred between legal and operational actions, repressing policing becomes encompassed by law and remains normatively legitimate within the polity and in the face of constantly present threat. So I don't know if, okay, maybe you will just ask me if you didn't understand something. As Gresgold shows following A.L. Weizmann, working on margins of law is a way to expand death politics. Weizmann showed how Israeli state is performing subtle forms of killing through restricting access to and flow of life-sustaining infrastructures to Palestinian regions. It is, in Gresgold's view, an example of death politics operating in legal gray zone, where law is used to insufficiently prevent death. Violence of the state then operates through law and through suspension of law. This leads Gresgold to a remark that there tends to be a sublimation of sovereign decision onto various biopolitical practices. So, the decision about who is going to die and who is going to live is not is dispersed, is not easily to define, or who makes this decision. It's just the system that makes this decision. Exception and governance through exception then is extended beyond emergencies into normal forms of life in liberal democracy. Once the violence is expanded onto everyday life, sovereignty is also changing. It is blurred, neither connected to the state nor to the law. As I will show, it is nested in governmentality, in rational healthcare knowledge that is based on science and intersecting with racialized gender regimes. If we think of a gap between EU freedom of movement law on one hand and lack of EU social healthcare policies on the other, it is exactly the gray space, legal space, where normativized violence comes in and death politics occurs in frames of law. Violence, in order to maintain social order, is outsourced to agencies and other actors. The aim is to prevent a catastrophe. Law then becomes elastic. It enables, Glasgow writes, governing agencies to use gray zones between obvious violation and possible legality, thus expanding the room for lawful action. Either way, violent action is not obviously illegal, and neither it is obviously exceptional, end quote. In a similar vein, racist divisions and intersecting distinctions are legalized through operational extension of law that is normatively accepted by the society. So with these considerations of resilience policy, Gräsgård shows that violence does not necessarily mean suspension of law, and death politics can also engage playing with law, giving way to death politics within the frames of law. Now, how this refers to the case we have here. I want to show that the situation of marginalized HIV-positive migrants is a condition set out by resilience policies of blurred responsibility and sovereignty, enabling death politics in frames of law. Death politics moved to agencies and outside of state apparatus. Governmentality shapes state actions and those outside of state apparatus, underpinned by the norms of liberal capitalist society that is gendered and race, from which also resilience policy and empower is not free from. This governmentality produces kind of new microviolent necronormative normality and new social order that is hierarchically structured, producing new forms of deprived life of subjects that are already marked by exclusion. It produces populations in perpetual state of suspension where legal procedure and operational power of resilience policy do not strip individuals and groups from their subjectivity and citizenship entirely, but in more sophisticated way repositions them to their racialized place within capitalist logic of productivity and intersecting racist, gendered, and sexed divisions. EU citizens are non-deportable, although the ones I'm talking about here are economically non-active. Thus, according to racist discourse and law, they are a threat to social system, or they should take any work. And numbers show that it's mostly low-paid work. The health status and economic status of these migrants expose them to discrimination, but in liberal and progressive Berlin, there is no space for discrimination, yet they do not have access to social services and healthcare. Non-discrimination discourse reframes them as vulnerable, and they are targeted by resilience policies. While I will show in detail how they work on micro level, it is important to point out the development of the discourse and of threat coming allegedly from migrants from Central and Eastern Europe. Discourse on Sozialschmarotzer, which is, a discourse on people sucking out the social welfare system. One that accompanied EU enlargement process, and one that also has a longer history in Germany. And Birgit Rommelsbacher is a feminist scholar who showed how German identity developed also as opposed to through anti-Slavism or difference of Slavs. In consequence, EU citizens from new member states were barred from access to social services and regular job market from the moment of the enlargement in 2004 till 2011. And I don't know if you remember, there was this transitional period where members or where citizens of new EU didn't have access to job market. And later from 2017, the law has been changed in Germany. And for those economically non-active, one has to prove at least 5 years of residency in Germany in order to be eligible for social welfare benefits. Through that, pressure to take any job and pressure on low-paid markets supplied mostly by the citizens of the EU should be retained. It is an example of how the discourse on barring from life-sustaining welfare and healthcare of economically inactive EU citizens has been transformed into law establishing death worlds, necropolitics within the realm of law. This politics affects particularly non-active HIV-positive migrants, although they are targeted by resilience policies. While there are German citizens who are HIV positive that fall out of the welfare system, resilience policies are directed, as existing numbers show, most of all towards homeless people from new member states living in Berlin. Those being HIV positive are targeted by an anti-HIV organization sustaining therapeutic care, advocating for HIV positive people through biolegitimacy, providing community services, coordinating policies, addressing needs of this specific population. The organization also sustained networks of doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, networks to other organizations, to employers in order to provide people with ad hoc or more sustainable jobs and to integrate them to regular healthcare system. The organization, empowering and taking care of vulnerable population, fulfills its role as a coordinating actor of resilience policies, protecting the society from the spread of the virus and making decision who will live and who is going to die in an adaptive process of subject-object relations, as vulnerability is not an outcome of someone's actions, but product of social relations and state policies. And this organization is mostly financed by the government of Berlin. And Berlin is a land in itself, a state. One could ask why the EU legislation and EU policies leave out social and healthcare policies to the domain of the member states. And in that way, at least in context of inner EU migration, fuels resilience policy. However, within liberal frames of EU policies of the freedom of movement, various legislation, EU directives, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights protect EU citizens from discrimination that, as I will show, may enable access to life-sustaining infrastructures, although only to some individuals. These legal frames, through litigation, seemingly have the potential to expand the access to life-sustaining politics, but as I claim, they are not political enough in order to change the direction of resilience governance. The case study that I would like to present here is of Agnieszka and Piotr, who came to Berlin shortly after the border was open in 2007, when Poland joined Schengen Agreement. I met them on a meeting organized by a community-based organization helping people with HIV and AIDS while I was volunteering there. Agnieszka is rather short, frail-figured woman with blonde dyed hair and blue eyes. She has hasty movements, speaks and laughs loudly. Piotr is tall, rather strong-looking. He has light blue eyes and dark hair fashionably modeled with lots of hair gel. They are both HIV positive, suffer from addiction of intravenous drugs, and Piotr is also hepatitis C positive. It's a kind of hepatitis and żółtaczka. Before I met them in person, the employee of the organization reveals their story to me. She is a sex worker and is running her own business. But recently, she isn't working as much and stopped paying contribution to the healthcare fund and social insurance fund. So sex workers in Germany are able to have their own businesses, and through that, they are legally protected. Also through that, person being sex workers have access to state services. She thus fell back into depths. Before, it was the organization that helped her to go through the bureaucratic process and clarify how to get social and health insurance. Agnieszka's desire now is to apply for social benefits. Social benefits would have enabled her to work less and take care of herself and their 6-year-old son that is living with a foster mother after he was born in Berlin. Receiving social welfare would have meant that the German state paid her health and social insurance. Thus, she'd receive full health coverage that in the case of her HIV infection is a matter of life. Piotr is currently on a sick leave from a work as a cleaner in a hotel and is receiving sick pay. He struggles physically and mentally with worsening liver test results. He has problems keeping his addiction under control and claims he is very, very tired. The employee of the organization is telling me that he has big problems with his intravenous drug abuse but is willing to cooperate. By cooperation, he means following the advice of the organization in fulfilling the plan to secure both them a steady income, and through that, a sustainable and adherent HIV and addiction treatment. This cooperation means, in particular, following the paperwork and being prepared for and not missing the appointments at different offices and state agencies or doctors, keeping deadlines and managing contacts with institutions, and submitting to the regime of social and healthcare system. Agnieszka should allegedly be, as my colleague tells me, more rebellious. She is stubborn and develops constantly new plans that do not necessarily lead to the normalization of their situation. When I met Agnieszka and Piotr, they already have been in Berlin for many years, but have also stayed for longer periods in Poland. Before Agnieszka, with the assistance of the organization, registered her business at a local authority in Berlin. They were registered also thanks to the help of the organization in Poland as HIV positive in one of the big Polish cities close to the German border. In such a way, they could receive their antiretroviral treatment in Poland, but could live in Berlin close to their son, and the organization took care of their treatment's adherence. But at some point, they stopped going to Poland to get medications from there, and they never wanted to tell me specifically for what reason. From my own engagement and experience in the organization, I also observed that the hospital in Poland was gradually less willing to provide the antiretrovirals to Polish citizens in Berlin. In an HIV context, I hear from Agnieszka and Piotr only negative adjectives about Poland. I was told once by one of my colleagues who followed their case for a longer time that one of the reasons to register her business was Piotr's criminal record in Poland due to drugs and their concern about their anonymity in the Polish hospital. My colleague also tells me that Agnieszka was thrown out of the hospital in Poland while being pregnant because she was using drugs. Soon after, she and Piotr came to Berlin and she gave birth to the baby. From that moment on, the organization helped her first to get antiretrovirals from Poland, then to register her business, and through that gain access to healthcare system in Berlin. According to law, having first run the business gave Agnieszka later the right to apply for social benefits with a welfare institution, the so-called job center. After she reduced her workload and income and became unable to pay contributions to healthcare fund, and these are very high if you have your own business in Germany, it starts with 400 euros per month. One had to find another way to secure health provisions to her. That is, through applying for social benefits. We met at an office of the organization to discuss the ways and strategies to apply for social benefits for Agnieszka, so she can work less and keep access to full range of healthcare services. We discuss also how to proceed with Piotr's very poor liver values. Piotr, before he went on a sick leave, was working on a so-called 400 euro basis and received social benefits from welfare institution that would level his income with the breadline survival level and also enable him to use healthcare system. So from this brief description of the situation of Agnieszka and Piotr, we see a productive action of an anti-HIV organization, supporting them both in order to stabilize their life and most of all, to provide them with life-sustaining antiretrovirals. The organization is sustaining also networks of doctors that, often on charity basis, care for their clients. In an interview, one of the employees of the organization called the provision of assistance and healthcare to migrants as Schöneberger Modell. And the word model should suggest some kind of developed and institutionalized system, but it is rather a serendipitous and unsystemic intervention based on networks and charity or flexibility of lawyers, doctors, pharmacists, state officials, and sponsors. Each case is individual, and every step in help provision involves development of illicit and licit paths to provide healthcare services. So we can see that the organization is acting on the fringes of legal system, providing HIV-positive people with medications, often outside of pharmaceutical law, providing with healthcare services on charity basis, adapting to the situation of the gap between freedom of movement law and social and healthcare access law, and providing vulnerable people with care, simultaneously being an actor in resilience policies. One can ask, where is this necronormativity here? What we see is biopolitics sustaining life. The situation of HIV-positive migrants I described is marked by blurred responsibility regarding their health status and care, both legal and practical. Legal and political frames are unclear. They enable an emergence of operational gray zone in which they find themselves, but the organization is also acting within this gray zone. It is taking care of vulnerable populations, but it also has to decide upon life or death of the people it supports, a decision that is taken within dispersed sovereignty, when vulnerability of subjects and populations is not an outcome of their action, but of interrelations and state policies. Agnieszka is on a methadone program. Her doctor, as she tells me once herself, is complaining that her blood values could be better. So, as an HIV-positive person, you have to undergo regularly blood tests, and then these tests shows you whether you are taking the pills, the antiretrovirals or not, and what is the virus level in your blood. So the doctor claims that these values could be better, and her mental condition, as she claims herself, is unstable. She has panic attacks and periods of depression, and she needs comprehensive mental care support, including psychotherapy. The future of her health insurance is uncertain, and she currently cannot afford to pay her fees to the healthcare fund. When I talk with her about her mental situation, she assures me that she has no problem with drugs anymore, and she is in a substitution program and was able to reduce amount of methadone intake in a short period of time. She is both proud of her control over her addiction and of her negotiation skills with the doctor, as she was able to convince him to decrease the dose of methadone intake further. What she needs, as she says, is a regular psychotherapy. Addiction and HIV and Piotr's criminal record in Poland and lack of access to antiretrovirals push them out of Poland, where addiction is treated with isolation and through the imposition of self-blame. The border was open, and in the light of their addiction, disease, and discrimination, their EU citizenship opened new possibilities for them. Agnieszka became a sex worker because of addiction. She is the main breadwinner. And Piotr has no criminal record in Germany that enables them both, as Agnieszka once told me, to start anew. However, as I got to know from Agnieszka and my colleague at the organization, after Piotr received social benefits from Job Center, the organization was pushing them to get married so that Agnieszka, as a wife, and their child would be covered by his insurance provided by welfare institution. When I asked my colleague why Piotr was given priority and assistance provisions and why he was made responsible for income and healthcare for all of them, I was told that, quote, his drug addiction was more under control, end quote, even though his health condition at the moment I got to know them was weaker, both physically and mentally. Such a stance made by the organization on the path to healing of the two reveals how, in context of legal gray zones and in the face of threat of the virus, the heteronormativity of the social welfare system is reproduced by the organization by pushing them to get married. This pushes Agnieszka into a new position, from a breadwinner to one being dependent on her partner. The organization has been using law up till now as a tactic in order to provide them with life-sustaining healthcare and fulfill the aim of resilience policy. But now Agnieszka has to subsume to the heteronormative regime of social welfare. Outsourced violence of the state here is reproduced by the organization and should prevent the threat, the spread of the virus. So while the organization is taking care of vulnerable subjects in order to protect the society, their survival, however, is also dependent on their gender, sex, race status, and their inability or their ability to adjust or to negotiate these statuses. I assisted Agnieszka and Piotr for almost a year. We had some periods of lack of contact, but Agnieszka received antiretroviral therapy and substitution therapy within the regular healthcare system. HIV infection and addiction forces her to subordinate to the knowledge of clinical medicine and the healthcare system and to obediently follow the medical knowledge. Blood testing is a moment of control that further impacts the course of her life. Objective truth coming from numbers and providing proof for proper behavior classifies people as not being a threat, and is, in consequence, they are left out of focus of an anti-HIV organization. Their life is not in threat anymore, nor is life of the rest of the population. But if you cannot provide good numbers and they tell a different truth about you, you are still deemed as vulnerable, as a threat, and as an object of resilience policies, no matter what you say. Agnieszka reduction of methadone intake becomes a source of her agency. So she feels proud that she's, taking less methadone and has her addiction under control, and of feeling into control in her life. This feeling runs against what she hears from the organization and from the doctor, that her blood values are bad and that she has to get married, although she claims to be adherent to the antiretrovirals and to methadone. Not good enough blood values position her differently in comparison to her obedient partner, who receives support without further conditions, although he has actually more problems getting his drug use under control. So while she actually experienced empowerment from the organizations, gets both the virus and substances under control, she experiences also gendered violence. Certainly, to some extent, racialized gender violence towards addicted women and a sex worker coming from Central and Eastern Europe, but also gender violence that should bring her finally to normality, as resilience policy requires. She is deemed as a threat because of her antisocial behavior, drug use, and emotional instability, drawn out of objective blood results. She is threatened to be detached from life-sustaining therapy if she doesn't marry her partner. This is the place where gender discourse and the role of women becomes relevant, and her survival becomes dependent on her being within the frames of normal society, which on the background of her being a sex worker even has more violent aspect. It is only such situation that gives the society protection and certainty that only then Agnieszka poses no further threat. There is no exceptional power here, nor executive branch of security policies is enacted here, but violence through non-state agency based on unquestionable numbers coming from medicine and gender discourses in a situation of legal gray zone. These two factors, medicine and gender discourses, that impact access to life-sustaining infrastructures, exemplify dispersed sovereignty and responsibility, enabling death politics in frames of law. It shows governmentality underpinned by the norms of the rational and capitalist society that is gendered and race, a logic from which care for vulnerable population is not free from. Such governmentality produces new necronormativity within resilience policy, aiming at and empowering and support to vulnerable subjects, but also conditioning access to life-sustaining solution or detaching from them. It is here where death worlds is created. Violence is neither obviously illegal, nor it is obviously exceptional. What in medical anthropology is called therapeutic citizenship, sustained by the organization, maybe empowering through support, information, rights, and claim making. But this empowerment does not change violent governmental structures. It does not challenge necronormativity, politics of death in everyday operation of resilience policy, creating new forms of deprived life. I'm slowly reaching the end, but it will still take a while. In effect, Agnieszka grew suspicions towards the doctor cooperating closely with their organization and specializing in addictions and HIV. In her view, she had to take too many pills in her antiretroviral treatment. Her virus load was sinking not fast enough, and CD4 cell values increased only slowly. She feels barred from the knowledge production about her own health status. She remains merely an object of knowledge that further impacts her life. The values provided by the laboratory were the reason why the doctor, as I was told, also expressed his doubts about her being clean and her ability to adhere to the antiretroviral treatment. Agnieszka also became increasingly angry with the doctor because he didn't want to prescribe hepatitis therapy for Piotr, who was also treated by him. It was allegedly too expensive. Finally, she decided for both of them to change the doctor, and after that, I lost her from my sight for almost 2 years. I only got to know from a friend that she was happy about Piotr receiving a course of expensive hepatitis therapy from another doctor that does not cooperate with the organization. However, there is one more aspect to Agnieszka's story. At one point, she decides to apply for social welfare on her own, although it isn't fully legal, as she was living with Piotr together and they formed a so-called Bedarfsgemeinschaft, so a unit that, that is supported by the state, not as a family, or not a family, but a unit, a social unit. As she said, receiving welfare would enable her to take care of her mental problems and of the child that they want to get back under their custody. With her limited knowledge of German, she managed to find a lawyer and to use job center welfare institution, as I was managed to find a lawyer and to sue welfare institution, as I was told, based on non-discrimination clause of EU law. So her health status was used as an argument in court. Shortly afterwards, she started to receive her benefits, but this scenario hasn't been suggested by the organization. It is difficult to assess how much her activity was evoked by the support and empowerment she experienced from the organization. Certainly, such solution is not available for anyone as it requires cunning and money to pay the lawyer. One could claim that she used the EU legislation to expand the possibilities of accessing healthcare and overcome necronormative governance. While her persistence and courage is impressive, I think these actions are singular. They do not waive the systematic necronormative effects of resilience policies that I described. They may lead to new litigation, but as the shift in German law in 2017 in conditioning access to welfare of EU migrants show, the state is fairly quickly to limit that access, and the normative discourse seems to work also beyond the resilience policy. Shortly after this, she started to push through the idea of moving out of an overpriced small room that she and Piotr sublet in Berlin city center to a 3-room flat in the suburb. And in our conversation, she constantly underlined that this will be better for both of them and their child when it returns under their custody. While she gained some independence from her partner by obtaining welfare benefits on her own, she wasn't able to loosen the grip of heterosexism. She fell down into a new dependency from, as she put it, a wonderful man that was supposed to pay for their flat in suburb, but requesting sex. Moreover, as it turned out later, because they moved to a new district, they both had to undergo a new application process for welfare benefits without having a certainty as to the outcome. The new place, according to Agnieszka's words, should be a new beginning, but Piotr, unhappy about Agnieszka's new commitment, attempted suicide, and during a joint paramedic and police intervention, he attacked a policeman, making himself a criminal in Germany as well as Poland. So to round off Agnieszka's example, I want to refer to Gresgård once more. She writes, quote, "The subject of post-liberal resilience thinking is not a self-determining autonomous individual. It is in a post-liberal framing, willpower and control have given way to an interactive process of relational adaptation and preparedness. Resilience is an emergent and adaptive process of subject-object interrelations." We can see that Agnieszka, under the circumstances, tried many ways to come out of addiction and to stabilize her health. In a way, she was and is building her resilience in face of her health status, social and legal context. In an interactive process, she adapted skillfully to the circumstances, and resilience policies have done their job. Nevertheless, as the organization in its striving to improve Agnieszka's healthcare status drawbacks to the heterosexist and heteronormative discourse in order to normalize her, similarly, it seems she falls under the old heterosexist violent structure as well on her own path to health and well-being. As a conclusion, I want to rather open new perspective and questions than list fixed outcomes of my research. While the dynamics I described is based on considerations on necropolitics as an expansion of violence mechanisms of differentiation and normalizations into mundane and everyday life, as an interplay of bio and necropolitics within resilience policies, it is certainly a dynamic describing German situation and specifically Berlin, with its liberal self-image but post-liberal governance leading to emergence of death worlds. Certainly, resilience policies in context of HIV and Poland is different, and it is legitimate to say, based on Agnieszka's and Piotr's example, that they are marked by necropolitics and not necronormativity, sovereign decision to kill. Also, well, that is a bold statement, I just realized. Also, resilience policies and necronormativity are surely emerging differently in different health, political, and security contexts. I think an ethnography can give valuable insights into ways these normativized violences are enacted and to push new perspectives on these ever-changing mechanisms of what I would call slow differentiations rather than everyday bordering. The issues I described depict the striving not to draw a clear and new border and keeping the others outside, but keeping those as deemed as potential threat within and letting them quietly die in frames of resilience policy, focused on vulnerable populations. I think this perspective in context of inner EU migration and healthcare brings into light more elusive forms of violence in context of less exceptional and more dispersed sovereignty. And anyone working on EU governance is aware that it's this dispersed sovereignty and is a characteristic of EU political system. In context of less exceptional, more dispersed sovereignty and not based on fabrication of the other, but targeting so-called vulnerable populations. In my example, I showed how science and medicine in a rational society, together with legitimated and legitimized discourses on gender as a set of values, legitimize necropolitical actions. These elusive violences, dispersed responsibilities and sovereignties, as well as blurred division between us and them, produced and fueled by liberal EU governance, nevertheless reproduce hierarchies and graded forms of access to resources or even death worlds. In consequence, one could claim that the border is everywhere, and mechanisms of bordering are entering everyday life. But we already know this. I think, however, my examples show that it is perspectives on race critical and colonial forms of governance that gives us new tools to trace these forms of ever nuanced forms of divisions, distinctions, and differentiations, and also ways of eliding these distinctions and differentiations. Finally, at issue here is the notion of EU citizenship, politics of belonging, and the meaning of what is called European integration. So the future of liberal European project and the presence of racist legacies in it. There are political consequences of such policies, where responsibilities are dispersed and law is protecting only productive and healthy parts of population, while those deemed vulnerable are trapped in a system of supportive and violent actions and disconnected from life-sustaining infrastructures. And maybe this kind of governance, maybe this kind of governance, similar to resilience policies that I described here, with blurred lines between law and execution, between responsibilities, seemingly inclusive and supporting, but having necropolitical outcomes, are the reason for growing populist backlash and ideological construction that seems to always be able to find an evil and responsible for wrongdoing or failure. And maybe these policies are the reason why it is the EU that is particularly targeted by populist parties. I think in consequence, we need more race-critical and decolonial or post-colonial and decolonial perspectives in order to bring into the light more and more sublimed and obliterated violences, underline their entanglement with colony, and in such way dismantle both violences towards population not fulfilling capitalist and dominant expectations, and violence of populist politics, usually reproducing racist in origin hierarchizations. In light of what I described, however, it is legitimate to say that the European governance enables, to refer to Anne-Laura Stoller, spaces of ruination that are not distant and removed from enlightened and rational eye, but established in spatial proximity and in interstices between European and national law, and in the logic of late exploitative capitalism. Dziękuję. And I'm sorry it took me so long.
Thank you very much.